George Blake was the embodiment of the quintessential British gentleman, charismatic, intelligent, and radiating charm. To MI6, he was the perfect officer, the model of loyalty and discipline. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay a man driven by ideology and disillusionment, a spy who would betray his own country with devastating consequences. Records show he handed secrets to the Soviets during the Cold War, compromising hundreds of agents, reshaping intelligence operations, and leaving a trail of devastation that would echo for decades. This is the story of Britain's most notorious double agent, a man who lived two lives, deceived everyone around him, and escaped the consequences in ways few could imagine. My name is Michael Graves, but anyone who truly knew my family never used that name. In my father's world, identity shifted. Truth came in layers, and silence often spoke louder than words. For 25 years, he worked in the real secret services, dim rooms, coded messages, unmarked cars, and missions where one mistake could erase a life. Before dementia began stealing his memories, he handed me a worn leather diary, its spine cracked, its ink fading. Inside were the things he never dared say aloud: names, patterns, warnings, stories of agents who vanished, operations rewritten in official files, successes that hid darker truths, and enemies who weren't what they seemed. Some secrets were so strange, I still wonder if he meant anyone to read them. What I'm sharing today draws partly from public records, but much of it traces back to the patterns he described. And every time I thought I'd found the most shocking detail, the next page proved me wrong. I'm not here to create fear, only to show that real truth is never simple. The deeper I went, the more I realized how rarely the official story matches reality. Today, we uncover the hidden life of George Blake. Not the softened public version, but the real one buried beneath politics, classified archives, and forgotten reports. Most people think they know this story. They don't. In this video, you will discover truths that don't just challenge the narrative. They rewrite it entirely. And if the beginning shocks you, wait until the end. Because the last detail is the only one my father underlined twice in red. Before we go any further, make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because uncovering stories like this, where the official record barely scratches the surface, is exactly what this channel is built for. You'll want to stay until the last revelation, because the truth about George Blake is stranger and darker than anything Hollywood could invent. George Blake was born on the 11th of November, 1922 in Rotterdam, a city whose streets whispered stories of merchants, refugees, and the clash of cultures. Rotterdam was a melting pot of ideas, a city in which the old and new collided, where international shipping brought the world to its harbor. Perhaps it was here, amid the commerce and chatter of multiple languages, that the young George first learned the value of observation, of noticing things others overlooked. His family name had once been Bear. Albert, his father, was born in Egypt and of Jewish descent. Albert's life had been etched by war. He had served in both the French Foreign Legion and the British Army during the First World War, leaving him with deep facial scars and lungs weakened by gas attacks. The stories Albert told were more than tales. They were templates for courage, cunning, and survival. Yet they were also reminders of the fragility of human life and the moral compromises required to endure it. George's mother, Catherine, was Dutch, upper middle class, and a remonstrant Protestant. Her household carried a rigid structure, yet one suffused with religious fervor. The young George balanced two worlds: the adventurous, scarred stories of a father hardened by war, and the moralistic, structured worldview of his mother. He had two younger sisters, Adele and Elizabeth, and for a time, the family lived comfortably among bourgeois conservative circles in the Netherlands, admiring the Dutch royal family and adhering to traditions that seemed eternal. It was only when the family fortunes faltered after the Wall Street crash of 1929 that the first cracks in George's childhood appeared. Business failures forced Albert to confront hardships he had never known, and when he passed away in 1936, George was just 13. The loss was compounded by the revelation of his Jewish heritage, something his father had kept hidden. It was a shock that would leave an indelible mark on George's sense of identity, a seed for the ideological explorations that would later define him. After his father's death, George was sent to live with a wealthy aunt in Egypt, a country as foreign to him as it was transformative. There, at the English school in Cairo, he began assembling the foundations of his worldview. He fell under the influence of his cousin Henry Curiel, a flamboyant, extroverted Marxist whose ideological fervor was contagious. Curiel's radicalism was more than theory. It was action. He organized demonstrations, endured arrests, and openly challenged the structures of colonial authority. In a diary entry years later, George would admit that Curiel's influence planted the first seeds of ideological conflict in his mind. Yet even as he absorbed these new ideas, he remained tethered to the Protestant faith his mother championed, a paradox that would follow him into adulthood. His ambitions at the time were simple, almost naive. He wished to enter the church, to preach, to uphold morality in a world increasingly defined by chaos. But history had other plans. When the Second World War erupted, George was on a summer visit to the Netherlands. In May 1940, he witnessed the Blitzkrieg sweep through Rotterdam, a city once bustling with life reduced to smoldering rubble. George cycled away from the devastation to The Hague, hoping to find his mother and sisters, only to learn they had already fled to England. In that moment, George faced the first of many moral and strategic decisions that would define him. He refused to leave his homeland, choosing instead to resist the Nazi occupation. At just 17, George joined the Dutch resistance as a courier. The role demanded a combination of courage, cunning, and audacity. He delivered underground newspapers and gathered intelligence on German troop positions, slipping through patrols and checkpoints with a youth's advantage and a nerve tempered by desperation. His work was dangerous, almost absurdly so. There were moments when a single misstep could have led to execution. And yet, George persisted, driven by a combination of patriotism, personal identity, and the need to prove his moral compass. In the small village of Zund, George lived with a local family while planning his eventual escape to England. 2 daughters of the household became unwitting partners in his journey. A German soldier stood between him and the Belgian border, only 100 yards away. The girls recognized him from church. He was waved through, a detail that might have seemed minor at the time, but would later weigh heavily in George's reflections on luck, fate, and the fragility of human plans. His journey through occupied France and Spain would test him further, culminating in months of internment in Spain, a brief brush with Franco's shifting policies, and finally, a perilous crossing into Gibraltar before reaching London in January 1943. Even then, the story was far from over. Upon arrival, George faced scrutiny and suspicion. Security investigations were relentless. Each word he spoke, each gesture he made, was measured against the invisible ruler of counterintelligence. His British citizenship was verified, his identity confirmed. And yet, the seeds of his future betrayals were already present, hidden beneath layers of loyalty, ideology, and youthful idealism. At this point, George was reunited with his family. His surname changed from Bear to Blake, a symbolic gesture marking both the continuity with his past and a stepping stone into a life that would straddle truth and deception. His decision to join the Royal Navy seemed straightforward, yet each step carried hidden implications. He was initially disappointed to discover that his assignment involved mini-submarines rather than espionage. Yet his skills, fluency in Dutch and German, familiarity with covert operations from the resistance, caught the attention of the Special Operations Executive, the British Secret Service arm that would form the bridge between his patriotic beginnings and the double life that awaited him. It was a slow ascent, a meticulous training ground where he honed observation, cryptography, and human intelligence. The world of intelligence was not glamorous. It was painstaking, obsessive, and often thankless. But it shaped George into the man who would eventually betray it with an almost clinical precision. The first brush with field operations came in Hamburg in 1945, a city still trembling from wartime destruction. Blake interrogated former German U-boat commanders, established networks of informants, and began to understand the delicate dance of intelligence, loyalty, and coercion. In these early experiences, he learned how information could be more powerful than weapons, how secrets could shift the balance of nations, and how personal ideology could steer one's hand in ways that loyalty alone never could. As George returned to Britain, Cambridge University became his new proving ground. Beyond academics, it was a fertile place for recruiting, observing, and testing ideological leanings. A professor with Russian roots introduced him to a culture and worldview that resonated with the doubts he had been harboring. The seeds of ideological fascination took root here, subtle and insidious, as he absorbed the nuances of Russian language, culture, and the contradictions of the post-war Western world. And then came Korea. George Blake arrived in Seoul, South Korea, in November 1948 under the official title of Vice Consul. To the casual observer, he was a diplomat performing routine duties, managing papers, attending meetings, and liaising with local officials. But in truth, George's mission was far more dangerous, far more clandestine. He was there to gather intelligence on communist activities in the North, to build networks of agents, and to monitor the Soviet Union's influence in the region. He was armed with little more than his wits, his linguistic skills, and the assumption that his loyalty to the West was unshakable. Korea in 1948 was a country on the knife's edge. The division along the 38th parallel had created two nations with opposing ideologies, each backed by superpowers willing to assert dominance at any cost. The North, under Soviet guidance, was heavily militarized, disciplined, and ideologically rigid. The South, propped up by American influence, was politically unstable, prone to corruption, and deeply divided. Blake observed the dynamics of power with a critical eye, noting inefficiencies, contradictions, and, increasingly, moral compromises. The more he saw, the more uneasy he became. His early missions to establish networks of agents in North Korea met with frustration. Information was scarce, trust was rare, and many of his contacts vanished without warning. American-backed officials in Seoul struck him as ineffectual, even corrupt, and Blake began to perceive a pattern. Loyalty, in this world, was transactional, and ideals were subordinate to power. In the quiet hours, alone in his office, he began reading books sent to him by the North Korean prison authorities, texts by Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. The ideas were intoxicating, offering an alternative vision of society in which inequality and exploitation could be addressed through ideology and discipline rather than mere politics. Everything changed on June 25, 1950. The Korean People's Army from the north launched a sudden, devastating attack on Seoul. Chaos erupted as the city fell under occupation almost immediately. British and United Nations forces scrambled to respond, but for Blake, the situation became personal. Alongside fellow diplomats, he was captured by North Korean troops and forced to march northward through the ruins of cities, over bridges swept away by bombardments, and past civilians fleeing for their lives. He witnessed the full scope of modern warfare, destruction on a scale he had never imagined. Civilians trapped in the crossfire, the precision and ruthlessness of the air campaigns conducted by the United States. Bombings leveled entire neighborhoods, and Blake could not help but feel both horror and shame at the human cost of the conflict. The march north was only the beginning. Prison camps in Pyongyang awaited him, places where survival depended on obedience, silence, and observation. Blake's ideological transformation began here, subtly at first, then with increasing intensity. Surrounded by fellow prisoners and North Korean officers, he spent long hours reading, reflecting, and debating. The ideas of Marx, Lenin, and the principles of communism captivated him. In this environment, stripped of comfort and distraction, he began to see the Western approach as flawed, imperialistic, and materialistic. Blake's captors did not immediately recognize his potential, but the Soviets had a network within the camps, observing Western prisoners for traits that could indicate susceptibility to recruitment. Among them was a young KGB officer, Nikolai Lenko, tasked with identifying prospective agents. Blake's intelligence, composure, and analytical mind did not go unnoticed. Lenko began a series of subtle interactions, conversations designed to gauge loyalty and ideological leanings without raising suspicion. In autumn 1951, Blake made the first tangible move toward betrayal, not under coercion, but by choice. He delivered a note written in Russian to the Soviet embassy, indicating he had valuable information. It was a calculated risk, a test of trust and ideology. Over time, he began meeting with Lenko, sharing insights into British intelligence structures, personnel networks, and operational methods. By now, Blake was no longer simply a prisoner. He was a prospective double agent, ideologically convinced that communism represented a better, fairer path than the system he had once served. The KGB's recruitment process was meticulous. Blake was asked to document everything he knew about the SIS, detailing personnel, safe houses, communication protocols, and field operations. Each entry he wrote was compared against intelligence already gathered by the Soviets from other sources, including the British double agent Kim Philby. The match was exact. Blake's recruitment was now complete. He had crossed the threshold from loyal officer to double agent, from prisoner to orchestrator of betrayal. Upon his release in 1953, following Stalin's death and the subsequent easing of tensions, Blake returned to England. To the outside world, he was a hero, a former prisoner of war, an officer ready to resume his duties with MI6. But inside, his allegiance had shifted. He was no longer serving Britain. He was serving Moscow. He resumed work at MI6 offices at Carlton Gardens, where he began supplying the KGB with a continuous flow of top-secret material. Each day, he worked among his colleagues, the very individuals who trusted him implicitly, carefully photographing classified documents using a MI6 camera during lunch hours or moments of minimal supervision. Blake's efficiency as a mole was extraordinary. He provided the Soviets with insight into operations, agent identities, and intelligence-gathering techniques. Many operations in East Germany and across Europe were compromised long before the British realized anything was amiss. Yet he remained outwardly the model officer, polite, methodical, and socially unassuming. The duality of his existence, the gentleman spy, was complete. His personal life also mirrored the duality. In 1953, he began dating Gillian Allen, the secretary at MI6. Their courtship was conventional, romantic even. Yet the shadow of Blake's secret work loomed over every interaction. By September 1954, they were married, and 3 children soon followed: Anthony, James, and Patrick. He maintained the facade of family man and loyal officer, while systematically undermining the very institution that enabled his domestic life. Blake's postings continued. In Berlin, he oversaw operations at the front lines of the Cold War, where East and West collided in espionage, ideology, and propaganda. He was stationed at offices attached to Hitler's Olympic Stadium, an ironic stage for one of the most consequential betrayals in Western intelligence history. Here, he exposed Operation Gold, a joint CIA and MI6 effort to tap Soviet communications via a tunnel beneath Berlin. Blake's betrayal was simple yet devastating. He had attended planning meetings, made extra copies of the schematics, and handed them over to his KGB handler. The Soviets knew of the operation from the start, and for years, Blake's meticulous duplicity ensured that Western intelligence was always a step behind. Despite the scale of his betrayals, suspicion did not immediately fall on him. Investigations began into a potential mole, led in part by the CIA, but Blake's careful concealment of his activities allowed him to evade detection. His success as a double agent was so profound that KGB files later revealed he had effectively neutralized Western intelligence operations in East Germany. Agents were compromised, arrested, and in many cases executed. Yet outwardly, Blake's reputation remained untarnished. To colleagues, he was simply one of the brightest officers in MI6, a man whose resilience and intellect had been proven through war and captivity. Even as he navigated this high-stakes deception, Blake continued his life with Gillian, the very woman who represented the stability and normalcy he pretended to serve, while dismantling the agency from within. Their family life, full of ordinary milestones, existed in stark contrast to the extraordinary duplicity that defined Blake's career. The tension of living a double life, the constant awareness that one mistake could end everything, was a pressure few could imagine. Each day he left the office with the same polite smile, returning home to dinners and laughter, while the Soviets received intelligence that could determine life and death on the other side of the Iron Curtain. It was a life of contradictions, sustained by discipline, secrecy, and a belief in a cause that few in the West could understand or accept. Blake's story, however, was far from complete. The KGB had made him a valuable asset, but the dangers were mounting. The more successful he became, the closer British intelligence came to uncovering the truth. By 1958, anonymous tips, intercepted communications, and leaks began pointing to a mole inside MI6. Investigations were underway, and the noose was slowly tightening around Blake. Yet he remained calm, methodical, and almost unnervingly confident that his preparations would hold. It would take years, decades even, for the full scale of his betrayal to be revealed. For now, he operated in the shadows, a ghost in plain sight, executing the game of espionage with a precision that would leave a mark on history far beyond the usual annals of intelligence failures. Returning to London in April 1953, George Blake walked through the same streets he had known as a boy, yet everything felt different. The city seemed calm, orderly, oblivious to the storm brewing within its intelligence agencies. To the world, he was a hero, a man who had survived imprisonment in North Korea and endured unimaginable hardship. But beneath the calm exterior, Blake carried a secret that would unravel decades of trust and loyalty. He resumed his post at MI6 offices on Carlton Gardens. The walls, lined with confidential files and operational maps, now held a different significance. Each paper, each schedule, each seemingly mundane memo became a thread in a web he could manipulate. With a Minox camera hidden in his desk drawer and a careful system of photographing documents during lunch breaks or when colleagues stepped out, he began funneling intelligence to Moscow. Every exposure, roughly 200 per month, was deliberate, calculated, and devastating in its potential impact. Blake was meticulous. He knew the stakes, understood the surveillance methods, and anticipated the smallest scrutiny. His colleagues considered him reliable, methodical, and even genial, a quintessential gentleman spy. No one suspected that their comrade, their friend, their peer, was orchestrating a quiet but catastrophic betrayal. The duality of his life was a daily performance, one that required perfect balance between normalcy and duplicity. In his personal life, he continued to court Gillian Allen. Their relationship flourished in the ordinary rhythms of life: dinner parties, family outings, and evenings at home with the children. Yet Blake remained ever aware of the secret he carried. The diary later revealed his private thoughts, moments of doubt, fleeting pangs of guilt, but mostly a resolute belief that he was serving a greater ideological purpose. To betray Britain was not betrayal of people, he rationalized, but a pursuit of what he believed to be justice for humanity. By 1955, Blake was stationed in Berlin, the ideological front line of the Cold War. East and West collided in espionage, propaganda, and political tension. He oversaw operations with meticulous care, leveraging his position to expose Operation Gold, a top-secret initiative to tunnel beneath Soviet communication lines. Blake had attended the initial planning meetings, copied the schematics, and handed them to his KGB handler. The operation was compromised from inception, yet the West remained oblivious. It was a triumph of subtlety, deception, and intelligence on Moscow's side. As months turned into years, Blake's network of influence grew. He recruited agents, intercepted communications, and compromised entire operations. The Soviets trusted him implicitly. MI6 remained unaware. He lived a life of careful contradiction, balancing domestic normality with global betrayal. Each day was a tightrope walk, and the diary paints a chilling portrait. The man who smiled at colleagues while delivering death sentences through leaked intelligence. By the late 1950s, the cracks in MI6's armor began to show. Anonymous informants, intercepted communications, and strange operational failures hinted at a mole embedded deep within the organization. Intelligence officers scoured reports, analyzed discrepancies, and questioned agents, but Blake remained untouchable. His methods were too clever, his discipline too precise, his cover too seamless. The diary reveals the tension of this era. Each day, Blake felt the weight of potential exposure. Every glance from a colleague, every unscheduled meeting carried a hidden threat. Yet, he remained confident, trusting his meticulous planning and understanding of both Soviet and British intelligence procedures. In 1958, the American envoy in Bern received an anonymous letter containing crucial intelligence about a possible mole in MI6. The letter reached the CIA rather than Hoover at the FBI and set off a chain of investigations that would eventually lead to Blake. To the world, he was still the model officer, reliable, methodical, courageous. Behind the scenes, however, he became increasingly aware that the game of espionage had shifted from strategy to survival. The Soviet Union relied on him, British intelligence suspected him, and he carried a secret that could shatter the lives of hundreds. This duality, chronicled in the diary, became the defining tension of his life, a constant test of nerves, intellect, and ideological commitment. The unraveling began in April 1961. Blake was summoned to London for a routine interview at MI6's personnel department. He trusted his KGB handler's assurances that nothing was amiss. Yet, as he entered St. James Park, he was met by a stern panel of agents, documents spread across the table, each proving his betrayal. Over 48 hours, Blake faced relentless interrogation, bombarded with evidence, forced to confront the reality that his meticulous cover had finally failed. He initially denied everything, relying on his calm demeanor and intelligence to withstand pressure. But when CIA agents suggested he had been coerced into espionage during his imprisonment in North Korea, he reacted instinctively. "No," he said, "this was my choice." In that admission, the interrogation shifted. Blake's ideological commitment, his agency, and his deliberate actions were undeniable. The trial at the Old Bailey in May 1961 was historic. Charged under the Official Secrets Act, Blake faced 5 separate counts, representing different periods of his betrayal. The maximum sentence for a single offense was 14 years, yet due to the multiple counts, his punishment totaled a staggering 42 years, the longest non-life term ever issued by a British court at the time. Public reaction was one of shock, outrage, and disbelief. How could a man who endured years as a prisoner of war turn against his own country with such meticulous precision? The diary records Blake's astonishment, his reflections on justice and punishment, and the paradox of cooperating fully, yet receiving a sentence meant to incapacitate rather than rehabilitate. He remained calm, yet internally, he must have felt the weight of isolation, betrayal, and the profound consequences of his choices. Wormwood Scrubs Prison, with its towering walls and iron gates, was designed to be inescapable. Yet for George Blake, it became the stage for one of the most audacious prison breaks in British history. Connections formed with fellow inmates Sean Bohr, Pat Pottle, and Michael Randall laid the groundwork for a plan that would confound authorities and become legend. Bohr smuggled a two-way radio into the prison, enabling covert communication. Pottle and Randall raised funds for vehicles, safe houses, and logistics outside. After months of preparation, the night of October 22, 1966, arrived. Blake slipped away from the prison theater while guards were distracted, scaled walls, and descended using a rope ladder. A fractured wrist and momentary unconsciousness did little to deter him. Bohr bundled him into a getaway car, and the pair vanished into the night. The manhunt was unprecedented. Airports were scoured, embassies checked, and rumors spread that Blake might be smuggled in a harp case belonging to a visiting orchestra. For weeks, sightings were reported across the globe. In reality, Blake remained hidden in London, moving between safe houses, planning his final escape to Moscow. On December 17, 1966, he was smuggled across Europe in a camper van, finally reaching East Germany. A KGB officer greeted him, whisking him away for debriefing. Blake's gamble had paid off. Moscow became both sanctuary and cage. The Soviet Union welcomed Blake as a hero, a brilliant agent who had struck at the heart of MI6. Yet he was a man severed from his family, living in a country of language, customs, and politics that were foreign. He reconciled with some of his children, remarried in 1968, and tried to craft a life within the Soviet system while continuing to reflect on his choices. Awards came, including the Order of Friendship from Vladimir Putin in 2007. By 2012, Blake was 90, living on a KGB pension, largely blind, yet ideologically steadfast. In interviews, he reflected on his life, unapologetic for his beliefs, steadfast in his conviction that loyalty was to ideology, not country. His diary reveals moments of melancholy, longing, and rationalization, painting a complex portrait of a man who lived by conviction and who paid the cost in isolation, controversy, and infamy. George Blake died on December 26, 2020, at the age of 98. The news reverberated across intelligence communities and media outlets worldwide. In Russia, he was lauded as a dedicated professional. In the West, he remained a symbol of betrayal. His life spanned nearly a century, encompassing heroism, deception, ideological struggle, and human complexity. The diary underscores the patterns of loyalty, ideology, and secrecy that Blake exemplified. He was a man who lived entirely in the shadows, a gentleman spy whose decisions altered the course of intelligence history. The legacy is contested. Some view him as a traitor, others as a man of principle. The final entry, underlined twice in red, reads like a warning and a testament. Betrayal is not born of necessity alone. It is a choice, and the consequences ripple far beyond the individual. In the end, George Blake's life was not just a story of espionage. It was a study in human complexity, ideological conviction, and the razor's edge between loyalty and betrayal. The world he navigated was one where identities were fluid, truth was layered, and silence often spoke louder than words. If you found this story gripping, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss an untold spy story that rewrites history with every revelation.